Hello everyone. This tutorial is about how to build a camera rig to use with my VPStudio project. The camera rig is really two things. One is the actual physical rig that you use to hook the tracker to the camera in the real world, and the other one is the Unreal actor that represents the rig and its measurements inside of Unreal. After my last tutorial about measuring the entrance people, I got a lot of messages back saying that people were still a little bit confused about what it was, how it works, and how it affects the alignment of objects in the world. So I'm going to give you a little more information about that now before we start talking about building a rig. So if you look at the screen now, you'll see a few things. Up here on top, this is the setup similar to what you'd use out in the real world for measuring the entrance people. You'd have your camera and two sticks. In this case, the first one's about 1 meter away from the camera and the second one's about 4 meters away. Like I told you in the previous tutorial, the process for getting the entrance people measurement is to slide the camera forward and back until you find the spot where when you pan the camera, these two sticks stay together. So what happens if you don't have the right entrance pupil measurement? Well, the demo I've set up here in Unreal is an example of that. I have two cameras. One is I'm calling the Unreal camera. That represents the camera inside of the Unreal. The other one is called the Real World camera, which represents the camera out in the real world. And I've got them set up so there's about an 11 centimeter offset between the Real World camera and the Unreal camera, which is very similar to the error I had in my original virtual production setup here. Now you can see what happens if I pan those cameras together. You can see the one on the left, the Unreal camera, because it's rotating about its entrance people, has kept those two sticks perfectly aligned. But the Real World camera, because it's not rotating around the entrance people, has them broken apart. So the end result here is if both cameras are not rotating around their entrance pupils, the Real World and the Unreal camera will not match up, so objects won't stay in alignment. Now I've removed that offset, so both of the cameras are rotating about their entrance people now. And you can see that if I pan them like I did before, the objects stay in place. On both cameras you see the same alignment, which is great. So obviously you want to set your cameras up this way. And the way you do it, after you found the entrance people that I explained in my last tutorial, you'll build a rig that matches your real world camera rig, and that transfers all the measurements into Unreal necessary to make sure that the entrance people of your Unreal camera and your real world camera are properly aligned with each other. So when I talk about a rig, what I mean is the collection of parts used to attach the tracker to your camera and the whole thing to a tripod, just like you see in these pictures here. In this case, there's a Sony a7R IV mounted in a small rig camera cage with a standard Vive tracker mounted on top of that. The lens is a Sony G Master f2.8 24-70 zoom. You don't really need the camera cage, but it provides more secure mounting for the camera that's less likely to wiggle, and it also lets you attach things like handles so that when you're using the camera handheld, it's more easy to hold it. This tripod also has a quick release plate that slides forward and back, which is really useful when you're trying to measure the entrance people. The other thing people were having trouble with was once you have gone through the process of sliding the camera forward and back to find the entrance people, where do you exactly measure it from? And this shows that. If you look at the blue arrows, you can see that once you've got your camera set up so that you're not seeing any parallax when you pan, you just measure from the center of the tripod pivot up to the center of the lens, and that's where the entrance pupil is. I also got a lot of questions about how to measure the offset from the tracker to the entrance pupil on your camera rig. The picture on the left shows the basic measurement you need to get, down from the tracker mounting screw and then over to the entrance pupil. The picture on the right shows how I usually do the measuring. I break it up into several steps because the camera has an irregular shape and it's just easier to do the measuring this way. You can see I measured down from the tracker over to the center of the camera, down to the center of the entrance pupil, and then out. You can see the piece of hardware that the tracker is mounted on has a pivot under it. You need to capture the position of this because you're probably never going to get it perfectly straight by eye, so you need to be able to adjust that pivot inside of Unreal. To make these measurements, I use a set of calipers because they make it easier to get something precise, but you can do it with a ruler as well. Now that you've got your camera all rigged up in the real world and you've measured the dimensions of your rig, you're ready to go into Unreal and build a version of that rig inside of Unreal. This is actually pretty easy to do and can be done using only the tools inside of Unreal. You don't have to be a 3D modeler or an artist to make something that works. There's several benefits to this approach of doing a rig inside of Unreal. The main one is that it's easier to adjust the rig in Unreal to match the real rig out in the world. In the real world, rigs are not perfect, and some of the joints have a tendency to be off by a little bit, like a degree or two, particularly if you're using something like a ball head, which is almost impossible to get straight by eye. Even an error of about a half a degree will be noticeable. With this rigging system, you can build in adjustment points any place on your rig that might bend or twist, and easily tweak the alignment when you're in Unreal and getting set up to do a shoot. Also, once you've got one of these rigs set up correctly with the right measurements, the Unreal camera will always follow your real camera no matter how you mount it. So you can handhold it, carry it around, put it on its side, whatever you like, and the entrance people of the Unreal camera will always follow the entrance people of your real camera. So how do you build your camera rig? Well, I put 3 different examples inside of the VPStudio project in this folder marked camera rigs. You can see them here. 2 of these are rigs that I actually use. The first one is the rig for the A7R4, which was in the pictures I showed you earlier. And the second one is for the rig that sits on my Rhino camera bot. You've seen pictures of that before in some of my other tutorials. The third one is just a simple rig for a sample. You'll also notice in these thumbnails here that every one of these rigs includes a model of a Vive tracker. Now that doesn't actually have to be there. I've only put it in there as a reference so you can see more clearly how the rig goes together. When you build your own rig, you can leave that out completely. It's not needed. This is what the simple rig asset looks like inside Unreal's editor. You can see it's pretty easy. The basic structure of the thing is you have the tracker with one offset down to where the film plane would be and a second one that goes off to where the entrance pupil would be on your camera. This is the sort of rig you might use if you had your tracker screwed directly onto the hot shoe of your camera. Now we're looking at the mount for the A7R4 camera that I showed you pictures of earlier. We start up here at the tripod screw, then we go down to that pivot that you saw in the original pictures. Then we go down to the shoe on the small rig cage, over to the center line of the camera, down to the center of the film plane, and then all the way out to where the entrance pupil is on the lens. If you look over here on the side, you can see how it's built. Each one of these is just a simple scene node that defines measurements from the previous scene node and any twisting or turning that you need to do. The other things are just cubes and cylinders used to represent these boxes and cylinders that you see hooking things together. Actually, you don't really need to do the cubes and cylinders if you don't want to. They're just there so that when you're looking at your set with an inspection camera, you can actually see the rig itself attached to the camera and the tracker. But there's really no need to have it if you don't want to go to the bother. Now I'm going to show you how to build one of these rigs pretty much step by step. I'll rebuild something that looks a lot like the sample rig without the tracker on it. Remember that all the joints and measurements will be dictated by the rig that you use to mount your real camera on. So you can't use this exactly as I'm putting it in. You'll have to use your own measurements and put in joints where you think adjustment may be needed. So start by going into the content browser in Unreal and doing a right click and saying you want to do a blueprint class and you want an actor. And you can name that something like new rig or whatever you want to call it. And then open it up. So the first thing I usually do is I get rid of this giant white sphere. And the way I do that is I say add component and I choose scene component. And then I replace the default scene root with that. And that doesn't have the giant white sphere attached to it. Makes it a lot easier to build and see what you're doing. Now we need 3 more scene nodes. One for a twist axis underneath the tracker because the tracker almost never is perfectly straight on its mounting screw. One is for the center of the film plane, and the last one goes out to the entrance pupil location. So I'll just quickly create 3 more scene nodes by duplicating the one that I've got there. And then I'll name them. And then I'll parent them correctly one right after another. Now we can put the measurements in. The tracker twist will not be offset at all, so we don't have to do anything to that. The film plane, let's say, is down, minus 10 centimeters. And we'll say the entrance pupil is out by 11 centimeters. And that's really all you need to build. But as you can see, you can't see anything. So it's a little hard to tell whether you built it right, and you won't be able to see the rig in the inspection camera when you're running VPStudio. So I like to add some graphical stuff, and that's pretty easy to do. I'll start out by bringing in a cube mesh. And I'll scale that mesh down till it's just 1 centimeter across. That's a good size. And that'll be the mesh that we use to represent the film plane part of the rig. And then I'll duplicate it. And we'll have a second mesh that we'll use to indicate the entrance pupil. And it's pretty easy to get these where you want them. All you have to do is drag them and drop them onto the scene node that they're going to represent, like this. And make sure they're marked as movable. Then just go in and zero out the location of each one of these cubes. And as you can see, they'll appear where they're supposed to now. But this representation of the rig is still pretty sparse. So the way I link the cubes together is by putting in some cylinder meshes. You can just jump up to add component again and choose cylinder. And since that cylinder starts out as a meter long, you're going to have to scale it down a bit. So I'm going to give it a scale of 0.005, 0.005, and 0.10, so it'll be 10 centimeters long. Then you can just click the blue arrow and drag the thing down till it lines up with the box properly. Remember that none of this graphics stuff has to be exact. The only thing that's important is the measurement of the scene nodes that should match your actual camera rig. And at this point I have to apologize. I was running my computer with the fans slowed down so we wouldn't have so much background noise, and it overheated. So I lost what we were working on, but I was almost done. So really the only thing left to do in that example was to copy the cylinder again and turn it and stick it between the other 2 cubes. So I'm going to continue on with the sample rig model because the only thing left to show you is how to hook up the bits of blueprint that make the rig work. When you're building your rig, you can just go over to the sample rig where I am here into the event graph and copy this stuff and then customize it to make it work for your rig. The first part of the rig is a little blueprint that takes whatever you attach to the rig and moves it all the way out to the entrance pupil. So for example, when you attach your camera to this, it'll end up in the same position as the entrance pupil node you see here. You can pretty much copy this bit of blueprint over as is. You can leave out the printout part if you want. If you happen to change the name of the entrance people node to something else, you'll also have to reconnect that. The second part of the blueprint is for adjusting any movable joints you might have in your rig. You generally want to keep this to small adjustments, not real big ones. In the simple rig, there's a twist adjustment right at the tracker screw because the tracker rarely goes onto its mount perfectly straight. And then there's another adjustment of the entrance pupil distance from the film plane, and that's so that you can adjust the entrance pupil to get as close to perfect alignment as you can. Your rig might have additional adjustments. You'll have to decide where you need them and just put in more blueprint code like this to send the adjustment through. The way it works is pretty simple. There's a couple of variables defined here, twist and entrance pupil. And those are made visible so that when you're in your VPStudio, you can go in and just adjust these live and see the results right away until you get everything lined up. And then these blueprint nodes just take either a rotation or a location from one of those variables and shove it into the appropriate node over here so that the tracker twist adjustment goes into the tracker twist scene component on the Z rotation. And the relative location of the set relative location here goes to the entrance pupil. Now, if you go out to the sample level, you can see an example of how these different components are used. Vive puck is what it sounds like. It's a Vive puck that tracks and outputs the tracked location. The A7R4 rig here is the rig that I built that I showed you earlier. The A7R4 is actually a model of the A7R4 camera. You don't really need one of these, or you can mock one up with some cubes and cylinders if you want to be able to see where your camera is. And then the VP Camera 2 is the actual Unreal camera that gets attached also to the end of the rig. Now I'll show you really quickly how you build up the complete rig. We start by dragging all the parts out onto level. So we need a tracker. I'll take the Vive puck, drop it there. And we need a camera rig. I'll use the A7R4 rig and we'll drop that there. Move it up a little bit so we can see it. And I'll want a camera model, and I'll take the A7R4 model and drop it there. And last but not least, we need a VP camera, and I'll drag that out also. And now all we have to do is connect everything together. So we'll go up here to the A7R4 rig, and we'll go down and attach that to the Vive puck. And we'll take the VP camera and attach that to the end of the rig. And then we'll go back up and get the A7R4 model. And we'll also, let's try that again. And we'll also drop that on the end of the rig. Now everything's assembled, but we still have to make a few adjustments to make it work. The main one is that underneath the Vive puck, you need to zero out the positions of all these things. And now it's all assembled. It's not going to look right, of course, because we don't have the trackers running. Then we want to take the whole thing and attach it to the talent marker so that everything will be relative to a talent marker. We also want to go in to the VP camera, and we probably want to shut off this camera model. And we'll want to go into the Vive puck. Find the motion controller and select whatever motion controller you want to use. Now when we go into the inspection camera view and zoom in on the camera we just built, we should see something that looks a whole lot like this. And when we select the rig, we'll be able to see the adjustments we built into it for tweaking it. And just to give you an idea what it looks like, you can obviously tilt around that joint. You can twist around the tracker axis like this, and you can slide along the entrance pupil. Most of the time you won't be doing anything with those adjustments very often. Only when your rig gets bumped or knocked out of alignment, you might need to add a degree or so to some of the axes to get everything to line up properly. And that's pretty much the basics of building a camera rig in the real world, building a matching rig in Unreal, measuring everything, and putting it all together. I hope this was helpful and will get you going on VPStudio with your own custom-made camera rig, and hopefully it will make your shots align better with the virtual world. See you on the next tutorial.